Okay, right. We've seen what you can do when you analyze the pattern of species formation and you put it together with evidence you can get from the geological record. And it turns out that they dovetail in a way that I personally find deeply satisfying. And I assume you're just hiding well the feeling of being absolutely blown away that I'm sure you're all experiencing right now. But it gets even better because you can start plotting this sort of thing on a global scale. And we'll start the story 94 million years ago. This is roughly, that's a little bit before, but it's very roughly the same time frame when a migrating herd of 23 sauropod dinosaurs, that's the great big ones with 4 legs and long necks and long tails, like the Sinclair gas station logo, right? Big brontosaurus type things. This is roughly the time frame when a migrating herd of 23 of them splashed through some mud and left a whole bunch of footprints that would eventually get re-excavated in what by that time was a gypsum quarry just outside of Nashville, Arkansas. Nashville is in southwest Arkansas, and most of the trackway, unfortunately, was not preserved, but we have some molds that were taken of big footprints. But yeah, we were home to one of the largest dinosaur trackways ever found, with over 1,000 tracks left by an estimated 23 dinosaurs all walking in one direction. Back when what is now Nashville, Arkansas was basically a big muddy beach. 94 million years ago, eastern and southwest Arkansas were all underwater, or shallow ocean and or mucky beach. There have actually been some bones of giant marine reptiles, technically not dinosaurs, called mosasaurs, that have turned up in southwestern Arkansas. I have not been lucky enough to find any, but they have been found, even a few dinos. You could have swum all the way up across Western North America, all the way to what's now Arctic Canada, although not really Arctic because there's no ice caps at this stage. And what used to be Pangea has very definitely broken up. There's still close connections, probably including some off and on land bridges between North America, Europe, and Asia. Pangea long ago split into Laurasia and Gondwana has definitely started breaking up, with the first continents to break away being Africa and India. Africa, of course, well, India, of course, will move north and eventually crash into Asia's underbelly. Africa will eventually run into Europe and create a lot of earthquake and volcanic activity in the Mediterranean Sea. This is why there are active volcanoes and earthquakes and mountain building in places like Italy and Greece. The rest of Gondwana is still hanging in together. You can see Australia and Antarctica down there. And Antarctica is still close enough to South America that dispersal is pretty easy. And 94 million years, okay, there's an alternate continental reconstruction. Did you guys play this on the playground, or was it all basically just Yu-Gi-Oh and Pokemon?
Say what?
You form 2 lines and one line shouts to the other, you know, Red Rover, let Ben come over. And whoever's name is called has to run at the other line, which is holding hands, and try to break through the line. I never found out what you won if you break through the line because I never could manage to do it. But yeah, this game, playground game called Red Rover. So yeah, here you have Laurasia saying Red Rover saying India over. as an alternate hypothesis for how the Himalayas formed. Anyway, 94 million years is the time frame in which mammals are starting to diversify. This is still in the age of dinosaurs. This is, I don't know if T-Rex himself was quite there yet, but there were a lot of big, ugly buggers with sharp teeth that were running around. The horned dinosaurs are around. I'm not sure Triceratops is quite there, but we have things like Protoceratops and basically BJ and Baby Bop from Barney, which I'm sure you all remember very well. Yes, right? That is your generation, right? I love you, you love me. I've had a lobotomy. Yes? What's that? Okay, right. Well, BJ and Baby Bop were basically horned dinosaurs, and they're around at this time. But there were mammals there too. In fact, mammals, the line leading to mammals is almost as old as the oldest dinos. There just weren't any big ones. Gesundheit. The largest mammal that would have lived during the time when the dinosaurs were running around would have been, I think the biggest one they know would be roughly the size of a Cocker Spaniel. Most of them would have been more mouse-sized or squirrel or shrew-like. If you'd seen one, you probably would have said, ooh, a little mouse, although technically they would not have been rodents, but small, furry, skittery things is what we're talking about. Many of them, pretty much all we have are teeth, but there's a few places where we can find more complete skeletons. This is one from Mongolia. It's preserved very completely because it was buried in a sand dune that hardened into rock. And you can see most of the skeletons there. And from the presence of a couple of extra bones on the pelvis, we can tell it's a marsupial. It's one of the lines of mammals that gives birth to underdeveloped young and then nourishes them in a pouch. Marsupials appeared in Asia. That Asiatherium that I showed you just now is one of the first. And by 66 million years ago, which is when Earth got whacked by some big-ass rock from outer space that caused ecological collapse around the planet and ended up wiping out all of the dinos except for a few of the birds. They're the only descendants of dinosaurs we have. Certainly all of the big dinosaurs got whacked, and in fact, most of the birds did too. Right by that time, mammals had dispersed all the way around to North America and then to South America and ultimately across Antarctica, which did not have a polar ice cap, and they made it to Australia, dispersing through continental connections and also hopping down island chains. And there was probably a whole lot of speciation going on that we can't detect in quite as fine detail as we could with things like Hawaiian fruit flies. Here's the thing. There were also placental mammals at the time. Mammals, similar to ourselves, which nourish their young for a relatively long time in a uterus by means of a placenta. Technically, marsupials have a placenta as well, but it's very temporary. Whereas we, placental mammals nourish their young for a much longer period of time inside the uterus. Placentals are as old as marsupials, but only a few placentals made it to Australia before Australia broke off and became a ginormous island. And for whatever reason, the few placentals that made it to Australia died out there. The marsupials basically had the island all to themselves, and they radiated into a huge number of forms, including fossils Like up at the top, that's a jaw of a 25 million kangaroo relative called Nagamaroo. And below, that's a complete skull of a predatory marsupial called Ecaltodata, aka the killer kangaroo. So marsupials made it to Australia before their, while that was still easy for them to do. They dispersed all the way around the world. And it just so happens that Australia soon broke off. In fact, by about 66 million years ago, Australia is still joined with Antarctica, but there's more distance now between Antarctica and South America. And they radiated in Australia into a whole bunch of living forms, well, a bunch of forms that are now known as fossils. And for millions of years, Australia didn't have any native placental mammals except for marine mammals, which would swim there, bats and whales, or whales and seals and sea lions and such, and bats, which could fly there. Other than the mammals that could fly or swim, the marsupials had the place all to themselves, and they diversified, giving rise not just to those fossils, but to all of the crazy forms that Darwin noticed back when the beagle stopped there for a few weeks in 1836. And this is what happened. They radiated into all of these forms that were strangely convergent on placental mammal forms. So instead of North American flying squirrels, Australia's got marsupial sugar gliders. Instead of having placental moles, Australia has marsupial moles. Instead of placental anteaters, Australia got numbats. Instead of mice, Australia got perverted marsupial mice whose males copulate themselves to death every year. We talked about those a ways back. Instead of raising, antelopes or something like that, Australia got kangaroos. The only thing Australia didn't really get is big predators. And the reason was explained to me once when I was there that in Australia, at least today, the top predator is drought. That's the main thing that kills off the populations of herbivores. They don't really have room for a giant predator because the climate is basically what kills everybody. Yes.
What about the giant spiders?
Oh yeah, well then they're not giant spiders. They're pretty small. They're just deadly. Yeah, so you've got the deadly spiders, the deadliest snakes in the world. At the break, I'll have to play you. There was a Australian musical comedy duo called the Scared Little Weird Guys. And they do this song that they wrote for the Australian Tourist Board to try to attract tourists to see the amazing wildlife of Australia. And it's what? Redback funnel-web, blue-ringed octopus, taipan, tiger snake, candy-box, jellyfish, stonefish, and the poison thing that lives in a shell that stings you when you pick it up. Come to Australia, you might accidentally get killed. So yeah, it's a song about how everything in Australia is potentially deadly, quite possibly including the sheep. See, if you ever meet an Australian, shake their hand and congratulate them on surviving past the age of 5. It's really something. Anyway, there's about 4 million years ago, Australia actually did get a few rodents dispersing there. Those are placentals. And then Australian First Nations seem to have brought things like the dingo with them. And of course, since European settlement, Australia's got cats and rabbits and things like that. In fact, the rabbits caused a real ecological problem. But these marsupials have radiated in isolation into all of these crazy forms, many of which are convergent on placental mammals. Moving to South America, hope you like this part, Carolina, if you're still with us. The mammals that reached South America about 60 million years ago also radiated into some very unique forms. One form they One group that made it to South America was the marsupials. There are something like 60 species of South American marsupials, including, well, a lot we don't have common English names for because we never see them. But one that I recall is the yatok, which I think is the world's only aquatic marsupial. It's similar to a possum, but it can actually seal off its pouch so it doesn't drown its own babies and swim. So there's a bunch of South American possum kin in South America. There were also some placental groups that made it to South America, didn't survive anywhere else, and radiated at a time when South America, like Australia, was one ginormous island. A lot of the weird things about South America can be explained by the fact that between about 50 odd and 4 million years ago, it was a giant island that many mammal lineages never managed to reach. They just didn't radiate that far. And so there were some placentals that evolved only in South America. There was a group now extinct called the pyrotheres. That's the skull of one of them at the top that would have looked vaguely like an elephant, although it was not a relation. And a whole group of herbivorous mammals called notungulates, some of which were as big as rhinos, others of which were small. Propachyrucus right there would have looked vaguely like a rabbit. There was a great diversity of these notungulates that only were found in South America, never made it anywhere else, and unfortunately they are all entirely extinct. I'll show you why in a bit. I mentioned that there's about 60 odd species of South American marsupial living today, and there's fossils of them as well, and this is one of them. This is the skull of a critter called Phylacospilus, and it would have been roughly like bobcat sized, bigger than a domestic cat, and it's got these great big teeth. In fact, they look like saber-toothed teeth. It's even got this extension of its lower jaw to provide this kind of sheath for its teeth. It presumably fed the way that we think saber-toothed tigers did. What we think they did was basically chase prey and try to get up underneath and slash the belly. Predators, as a rule, tend to try not to engage in a knockdown wrestling match with their prey if there's a way they can take them down quickly and with less risk. For the same reason that World War II pilots used to say that if you're dogfighting, you've made a mistake. The thing to do is take out your enemy before they know you're there. And we think that what those saber teeth were for was slashing the belly, which is going to drop your prey from blood loss while you just sit there and wait. Anyway, I digress. That's a marsupial. That's more closely related to possums than it is to cats. And it's yet another case of convergent evolution. You have this lineage of possum kin that is not related to cats, but one group of them evolves the same kind of solution, the same kind of lifestyle and life history as the saber-toothed tigers would much later. That saber-tooth form has evolved at least 4 separate times in mammal evolution. So just like the Australian marsupials even today can be convergent with flying squirrels and moles and anteaters, etc., some of these marsupials in South America were convergent on placental mammals. Sometimes isolated groups hit on the same solution. Up there at the top left, that's the Brazilian short-tailed possum, which looks adorable. That's one of the 60-odd South American possums. And a placental group that made it to Australia that's still around is called the Xenarthra. That means strange joints. because they've got a funny structure to the pelvis. And xenarthrids include sloths and anteaters and armadillos. And this is another group that diversified in South America and only in South America because South America was a giant island. This is how we got the 14 or so species of South American armadillo, including the screaming hairy armadillo, which I still is what I'm going to name my country western punk band if I ever form one. Right, we're going to be the screaming hairy armadillos. And of course the sloths are, and there's a tree anteater for you. They're also in the Xenarthra, this uniquely South American group. Okay, you with me there? And by the way, this is why, if you think back to some of our earliest lectures, Darwin was very struck by the fact that you could find fossils that seemed to have some kind of link to the unique South American mammals. Remember, one of the things he found were these giant fossils that bore a strange resemblance to armadillos. Yes? He says something about this resemblance between the living and the dead will throw more light on the appearance of species than any other class of facts. This is why. It's because for much of the past 65 million years or so, South America has been a big island. Roughly 40 to 45 million years ago, South America is an island, but the Atlantic's only about a third as wide as it is now. And there are a few islands, they're not showing up on this map. There's a few little specks of rock in between Africa and South America. And we think it might have been that hopping across these tiny islands, probably from Africa, we got the ancestors of one group of rodents called the caviomorphs and some early primates, monkeys, apes, etc. And those, we think, dispersed to South America back when South America was a little easier to get to. And those ultimately gave rise to South America's unique rodents. South America has got lots and lots of unique rodents. Down at the lower left, that's a mara. It's a rodent, but it's convergent on rabbits. Guinea pigs are actually not from Guinea at all. They are from South America. Vicki McDonald has visited Peru, and she remembers going into a church that was built, during the time of Spanish colonization, but it was built by native artisans, native peoples who learned how to sculpt and paint and things like that in the style that the Spanish wanted. And she mentioned seeing a picture of Jesus and the disciples at the Last Supper, and right there on the table is a roast guinea pig, because the guinea pig was a common source of food in Peru in pre-colonial times. It may still be. One of these days I'll get down there. So yeah, guinea pigs are South American. Maras are up there at the top left. That's a capybara, the world's largest rodent. It's a rodent the size of a pig, apparently a very friendly creature. And incidentally, it's a fish. Capybaras live in these forests that periodically flood. So they've got webbed feet and scaly legs. And because of this, back in 1600 in Don't Care, the Roman Catholic Church declared capybaras to be a fish so that people could eat them for Lent. This season in the Christian year, when you're supposed to think about the suffering of Jesus, and it used to be that except on Sundays, you couldn't eat red meat in the Roman Catholic Church. You had to abstain from that. And they got capybara declared a fish so that you could eat it during Lent. And apparently in places like Venezuela, it is still enjoyed as a traditional springtime main dish. People still eat capybaras because they're fish. And also big rodents. Anyway, this is also where South American monkeys come from. Tamarins, marmosets, little South American monkeys with kind of like a big mane, big poofy hair on the head. Spider monkeys, capuchin monkeys, I think, the ones that organ grinders used to use. Howler monkeys and owl monkeys and proboscis monkeys. Those all made it to South America, or their ancestors, roughly 45 million years ago, and evolved and speciated and diversified there. By about 14 million years ago, things are starting to look pretty familiar. The continents have all pretty much separated. Africa is cruising northward and is beginning to slowly start colliding with Europe. Australia is way off on its own. Now that South America has separated from Antarctica, water can now flow around and around and around Antarctica, setting up the South Circumpolar Current. And that, plus the rising of the Himalayas, caused global temperatures to drop very fast, creating the polar ice caps, by the way. And changing the environments quite a lot. This is why we no longer have tropical rainforest in Arkansas, although it feels like it some days. But we used to have big, steamy tropical jungles in Arkansas. And rainforests tend to have rotten soil because all the nutrition either gets vacuumed up by the life or washed out by the rain. And you end up with this brick-like soil that's enriched in aluminum because it's depleted of everything else. This is why Arkansas has bauxite. Our bauxite deposits are actually ancient rainforest soil. That has ended by 14 million years ago, and we don't have rainforest in Arkansas now. And South America is still an island, but you can see there's a subduction zone running down the Pacific coast of North and South America. And by about 4 million years, you have enough volcanic activity that you've built a land bridge from North America to South America, the Isthmus of Panama. Yes?
It really seemed like the Indian subcontinent, like from the phases you showed, like really moved really quickly away from Africa.
Quickly, insofar as any plate tectonic movement is quick.
Quickly relative to the rest of the...
Yeah, it does seem to have covered a lot of ground. I'm not entirely sure why, but yeah, it does seem to have moved pretty rapidly. Plates don't all move at exactly the same speed. Oh, and yeah, so the Himalayas are going up, and back of the Himalayas, you've got the high deserts of the Tibetan Plateau. Part of that Tibetan Plateau is known to this day as Taklamakan, which apparently means in the local language, once enter, never leave. Rather dangerous place to travel. Anyhow, so the Isthmus of Panama is starting to form. Panama, right there. And when the isthmus formed, first of all, think about what that does to species living in the ocean. You have uninterrupted ocean between what's now the Gulf of Mexico and the Caribbean and the equatorial Pacific down here, right? There's no barrier. So what happens when that barrier forms? You have like a lot of marine species that can live in both places, and then the barrier forms. We get something that starts with a V and rhymes with vicarious. Yes? There's a lot of marine invertebrates on the Pacific side of the isthmus with an odd similarity to species that you find in the Caribbean. Here's a couple. I remember picking this up when I was 4 because we took a little trip to Puerto Rico. Because one of my dad's old friends from grad school was actually teaching there, and we got to stay in their apartment and camp out on their floor. You know, it's cool being able to couch surf with people in interesting places. And, you know, I remember don't remember a huge amount, but we went to a number of beaches and I picked up seashells, and one of them was a Strombus pugilis. The common name is the Caribbean fighting conch. Not sure why it's called that. Many years later, as a grad student, I and some friends of mine used to drive down to the Baja California Peninsula up there at the top left, and we'd camp alongside the Gulf of California and do marine biology. They were also going down there to take shrooms, although I never did. You know, I've got the straight edge, man. They did. I just had to drive them back. And anyway, one of the things that I picked up over there was a Strombus gracilior, the Pacific fighting conch. And you can see that gracilior's got a bit of a higher spire. You know, it's a little more narrow, pointy bit. But other than that, they're very similar in shape, same size, similar habits as far as I can tell. Another one that I remember from Puerto Rico is the Caribbean rock snail, Purpura patula, hauntingly similar to Purpura panza from the Pacific. Oh, hang on. No, they are not. I mean, they would be cryptic species if they looked identical or couldn't interbreed. I mean, these are still visibly related, but you can still tell them apart. You know, you could still tell Purpura patula from Purpura panza. But still, it needs explaining why you have closely related species on opposite sides of the isthmus. And the reason is that the common ancestor of those two must have once lived on both sides. And then when the isthmus formed, it must have split the ancestral species into two separate populations that could not exchange genes anymore. So each one has, you know, gone on to speciate. But yeah, they would only be cryptic if you couldn't tell them apart by looking, but they couldn't interbreed. Okay, with me there. The reason that my grad school buddies were going down to the Gulf of California was that one of them, a guy named Brian Simonson, was doing research on limpets. If you don't know, limpets are snails, but their shells don't have coils. Their shells just look like little peaks, they look a little bit like those Asian rice paddy straw hats that you see on, you know, racist depictions on Chinese menus and things like that. They look kind of like little cones. And he was collecting limpets from the Pacific side, and he was also getting some samples from the Caribbean. And he was working on a cladistic analysis based on DNA sequences, which was still a really new thing in 1996. To try to work out how the pattern of speciation of his limpets had been influenced by the formation of the Isthmus of Panama. So we went down there, we helped him collect limpets and did a lot of skin diving and a lot of scuba and learned a heck of a lot about marine biology, and they took a lot of drugs. I did not. Man, Simonson's now got a cushy job somewhere, and the other guy that took drugs is now at the Smithsonian, and I'm here. Should have taken the drugs, clearly.
They were enlightened.
What's that?
I said they were enlightened.
Yeah, I didn't want to. I see weird enough shit with my eyes wide open, stone cold sober. I don't know what would happen if I took shrooms. Okay, I don't happen to have Brian Simonson's research results, probably because they mostly consist of him going, oh, wow, man, whoa. Wow, this limpet looks like Jerry Garcia did. But I can give you another study on Pacific and Caribbean species of pistol shrimp. This is Alpheus, the pistol shrimp. You'll notice it's got one really big claw. This is because this claw can actually click in such a way to create an extremely loud sound and shock waves that will stun prey. So Alpheus will just walk up to you and go bang. And if you're a small fish or something like that, you fall stunned, and then Alpheus comes up and eats you. So yeah, definitely an advocate for the right to bear claws. Anyway, I came across a study from 1998 where they sequenced DNA from species of Alpheus, and this is part of their results. And to make it a little bit clear, I've color-coded it. Every Pacific species, every species on the Pacific coast of the Americas is in kind of teal, and every Caribbean species is in purple. And what I want you to notice is that the closest relative of every Pacific species is a Caribbean species. It's like they come in pairs. And again, this must be a pattern that you can explain by lots of vicariates. Every one of those pairs descends from a common ancestor that must have lived in both the Caribbean and the Pacific. And then all of those common ancestors got split when the isthmus finally formed. And there's about 20 pairs of what we call sibling species. And all of those pairs were created when the isthmus separated their ancestral populations. See, again, we can take what we know about speciation and see some beautiful examples of how it plays out once you've got plate tectonics. Things actually happen very differently for the land animals because land animals and plants are not vicariated. What they get is a corridor for dispersal instead of vicariance. And this sets up what we now call the Great American Interchange, where North American species of animals and plants dispersed to the south, and South American species of animals and plants dispersed to the north. Some of the unique South American life went extinct at about this time, and it used to be claimed that this was because they couldn't compete with the North American species that were moving in. This isn't necessarily true in all cases. It's probably a lot more complicated than that, but it is true that we don't seem to have no ungulates on the planet anymore. On the other hand, armadillos, those xenarthrans, and sloths, which are also xenarthrans and are now extinct, but we did have them until about 11,000 years ago. They came north, so did our possums, so did porcupines, which are another one of those South American rodents. You guys know that? A porcupine's a rodent? Yeah, and they're not just rodents, they are migrants from South America. North America, since going south, the only South American oak, I think there's like one species of it, is a fairly recent migrant from North America across the isthmus. Ditto for the South American spectacled bear. That is related to North American and Eurasian bears, and it got to South America by dispersal. Same for South American cats, jaguars, and things like that. They all came from the north. Raccoons, like the South American coati mundi. Rabbits and skunks and tapirs and camels. A lot of the South American life is actually immigrants from North America, and I'll bet they're wishing they put up a wall. And we call this the Great American Interchange. We got possums That's our Didelphis virginianus, our North American possum, actually a South American immigrant. They got spectacled bears. That's the only South American bear. And kind of a funny looking thing, if you ever see one walking around, it looks kind of like a human in a badly fitted bear costume. They're not very good at this bear business. We got the porcupines. They got the cats. You know, I don't know if you remember the old country song that goes, I'd start walking your way, you'd start walking mine. We'd meet in the middle on the Isthmus of Panama. Okay, that's not how it goes, but that's what happened. We also get some of the patterns been obscured by extinction. We used to have camels in North America. What you're looking at there is the skull of a complete skeleton that was found in a famous fossil deposit called the La Brea tar pits in what is now Los Angeles. Have you heard of this? The La Brea tar pits are these pits that have petroleum oozing to the surface. All of the light molecules evaporate away, and what you're left with is this sludge. And you have these tar pits that have a layer of fresh water on top. And between about 40,000 and 10,000 years ago, animals would come down to drink, and some of them would fall into the tar and die horribly and sink down into the tar where their bones are beautifully preserved and have been excavated for the past 100 or so years. There's a really cool museum next to the tar pits now, and they've found thousands of a sampling of the big mammals and birds that lived in North America between about 40,000 and 10,000 years ago, including, well, saber-tooths and mammoths and sloths. You know, basically the cast of the Ice Age movies is known from the tar pits. And so are these North American camels. And camels are native to Laurasia because they're also found in Asia and the Middle East. We had them in North America. They dispersed south, and they survived in South America, but North American camels died out about 11,000 years ago, which unfortunately has left the llamas to live in South America all a young. Get it? In Spanish, you pronounce double L like Y. So it's not llama, it's a llama. So it left the llama lineage all a young. This is funny. You are allowed to laugh if you want to. I'm just saying here. So the llamas are all a young in South America, while the North American camels died out. Possibly because of human hunting, although that's still a rather contentious subject. We used to have horses that were native to North America. Some of them dispersed south, and unfortunately they died out on both continents. And then we had no horses on either continent until the Spanish brought them starting in the 1500s.
Is it necessary the native North American horses by now?
Again, there's a mass extinction of what's called the megafauna, the big mammals, and incidentally some big birds that all die out at the end of the last ice age, roughly 11,500 years ago. It is a common hypothesis has been that this is about the time that humans appear in North America, and it was thought that they might have been hunted to extinction because it's mostly the big and presumably delicious mammals that go extinct. It's not that simple because we've now got pretty good, a lot of it's really hard to date, but I think we've got solid evidence now that humans were present in North America before the extinction. So it may have had to do with very rapid climate change at the end of the last ice age, Disease has been proposed. And again, I'm not really sure we absolutely know. I'm not really up on the latest. It's a pity I can no longer go down the hall and ask Tony Barnowski. I knew someone who was working hard on this, but that was a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. So yeah, anyway, after the death of the native horses in North and South America, there were no horses on either continent until the conquistadores brought them over in the 1600s. Horses and donkeys, of course. Okay, last thing. We talked about Alfred Russel Wallace a way back as the guy who came up with natural selection and almost scooped Charles Darwin. And if you remember, they did cobble together a joint paper in 1858, so both of them do deserve credit. Darwin had been working on it longer, but Wallace was a brilliant man in his own right and deserves some credit as the co-discoverer of natural selection. But he made a lot of contributions that were entirely his own, especially in the field of biogeography, which is just the study of why you find living things where you find them. And in Indonesia and Malaysia, at the same time that he is writing letters to Darwin saying, hey, I've noticed something, he's documenting something odd about the islands that make up what's now Indonesia. It's as if they are split by an invisible line. West of the line in Indonesia, you find living things that belong to groups that are typical of mainland Asia to the west. You find tigers, you find rhinos, you find pheasants and squirrels, monkeys, and orangutans. East of the line, you don't. You find parrots, you find cockatoos, you find an odd Australian group of birds called megapodes, AKA brush turkeys, although they're not really turkeys. You find birds of paradise. You find this tree-dwelling, fruit-eating marsupial called the couscous. You find tree kangaroos. And he described it like this. There are two islands in the Indonesian chain, the islands of Bali and Lombok. And as he put it, though of nearly the same size, of the same soil, aspect, elevation, and climate within sight of each other, a strong swimmer could swim from one to the other, yet they differ considerably in their productions and in fact belong to two quite distinct zoological provinces, of which they form the extreme limits. So that's what this looks like on a map. In red, that is so-called Wallace's line, with Bali to the immediate left and Lombok to the immediate right. And then farther to the north, that big island, that's Borneo. And on the other side, the island with all the funny branches on it that looks kind of like a weird looking hand, that is Celebes. And marking them off is Wallace's line. And in Indonesia, down there, Bali is down here. Lombok's right there. There are daily ferries to get from one to the other. And I mean, again, people have swum the English Channel. You could, in theory, swim from Bali to Lombok. And yet to the west, you get trogons. That's a group of birds. You get squirrels. That's what an Indonesian squirrel looks like. You get tigers. You get rhinos, or you used to before we killed them all and stole their horns. That's where you get Asian monkeys. You get deer. You get little mongoose and little carnivores that are related to mongoose called civets, sometimes called civet cats, although they're not actually cats. And you get those to the west of Wallace's line. To the east of the line, you get tree-dwelling, fruit-eating marsupials called cuscus. There's a cuscus at the upper left. Down below it, that's a tree kangaroo. That's another marsupial that's related to kangaroos but lives in trees. You get Australian-type parakeets and cockatoos. Down below at the lower right, that's a megapode, aka a brush turkey or scrub fowl. There's one species that's really cool. It incubates its eggs by laying them in nests in sand that's being heated by volcanic activity. It doesn't incubate its own eggs. It buries them in hot sand to incubate them.
It's kind of like hot springs, just
yeah. Mm-hmm. Yep. There's lots of parrots there. Birds of paradise are what you find east of the line. And there's no obvious geographic barrier between them. You know, there doesn't seem to be any, reason why you can't get dispersal from Bali to Lombok if you can get it among these other islands. And yet there's this, line in the sand, as it were, between Asian-type biotas to the north and Australian-type biotas to the south. Huh. He explained it thus: the inference we must draw is that the whole of these islands eastward, beyond Java and Borneo, do essentially form a part of a former Australian or Pacific continent. It is interesting to observe among the islands themselves how a shallow sea always intimates a recent land connection. Spelled British. Here's what the place looks like now. When the sea level was lower, remember again, the true edge of a continent is not the beach, because the location of the beach can change. Dark gray is the land today. That gives you the coastlines today. And then in light gray, all of that is shallow continental shelf that, when the oceans were lower, was all dry land. And you'll notice that what is now Thailand and Laos and Cambodia and Vietnam are up there at the top left, extending down to Singapore and Malaysia, and then Indonesia. And then Borneo and then the Philippines are kind of at the top center. All of those would once have been, they're on the same continental shelf, and they would have once been connected by land. If you're curious, by the way, as to what would make the sea level drop, remember I mentioned that we have in the past these ice ages where you had ice sheets going from the North Pole all the way to Des Moines, Iowa. You had this big ice cap covering pretty much almost all of Canada and big chunks of what's now the United States and all of Scandinavia and actually all the way to Central Europe. Yes, right? When those form, the water has to come from somewhere. And so what happened was you had lots of snow basically pumping water out of the ocean and dumping it in the form of ice to form these ice sheets and glaciers. So when the ice sheets are at their biggest extent, the sea level is lowest, and that's enough to expose all of this dry land. When the glaciers melt, sea level goes up, and we lose these connections. And it just so happened that there is no continental shelf connecting Bali and Lombok. The ocean between them doesn't look that different from other ocean, but it's 20,000 feet deep down there. So there's never been a land bridge between Bali and Lombok. And so there has never been a time when it's been easy for land animals to disperse from between Bali and Lombok. It's never been easy for Australian type animals to disperse north, or Asian type animals to disperse south. And it is also thought that another thing that's put the brakes on dispersal has been those islands down there, right where it says Wallace Line, right? That chain of islands belonging to Indonesia. That's one of the most volcanically active areas of the world. Krakatau is one of those. That's the one that blew up in 1883. An even bigger one down there, Tambora, blew up in 1815. It was bigger than Krakatau. Blew up in 1814. But the explosion put so much volcanic ash into the atmosphere that it blocked sunlight globally. 1815 is still known as the year without a summer. That was the year that they had frozen lakes in Philadelphia in June. There were crops failing and famines and high food prices all over Europe and America. Some of your ancestors might have come this way because this convinced a lot of the American colonists in New England to leave and look for warmer places elsewhere. And this is one of the reasons why people started moving into what's now Mississippi and Alabama and Arkansas. This could well be why some of their ancestors made it here, for all I know. Anyway, and that's all going on in Indonesia. That's all going on down here. And that may well make it extremely difficult for Australian species to successfully disperse up these chain of islands, because this chain of islands periodically explodes violently. Like Krakatau, 4/5 of the island vaporized when Krakatau went off. The tsunami picked up a steamship and threw it a mile inland. 35,000 people were killed by the tidal wave. When you've got things like that going on, that tends to put a brake, possibly, on dispersal going down that island chain. So partly because there's never been shallow continental shelf between Bali and Lombok, or between Borneo up here and Celebes down there. And partly because the land keeps going boom, you have a pretty sharp boundary that's been maintained between what we now call the Indo-Malayan and the Australasian biogeographic realms. And so that demonstrates why we have a border between 2 of the 8 major biogeographic realms. We've already talked about the distinction between the Nearctic and Neotropic realms and noted that there's actually been some interchange between them. But there hasn't been nearly as much interchange between Indo-Malaya and Australasia. And now you see why. And so there you have it. That's the kind of thing you can do when you take Earth history and geology and you put it together with what we know about evolution. You can, create some pretty powerful bodies of knowledge. And on that note, I'm going to stop the thingy, stop the recording, and I want to hand out exam 1 before I go. I should have exam 2 ready for you tomorrow.